Chapter 5. I couldn't whisper when you needed it shouted. In the back of the shop, there was a mirror. It hung on the wall, perfectly mundane compared to the shop's other wares hanging right beside it. Spiked clubs, flails, a set of knives that George could swear was rusted over with blood. Behind him, he could hear his companions, their footfalls near silent on the wooden floors, their voices low. Every now and again he'd hear one of them exclaim excitedly over some weapon or another, calling out to the other to share the new discovery. George was tempted to join them. But the mirror. It had been a long time since George had looked in one. For years, between traveling with Sapnap and finding the house, he'd only ever seen his own face in the distortion of pond waters, or in a brief glimpse at his reflection on the blade of his battle-axe before he plunged it into someone's chest. The god looking back at him was unrecognizable. His hair was longer, curling over his ears and the nape of his neck. He'd gained a faint scar or two from all of his and Sapnap's misguided misadventures. But that wasn't it. That wasn't what had changed. Gods didn't age, but George thought he looked older, and hell, he looked absolutely exhausted. "George?" Sapnap's voice, sounding far away. "George, we're ready to go." "I'm not," George said, still standing, still staring at the mirror and trying to figure out who used to look back at him in it. A flash of green in the corner, and George found Dream's eyes in the reflection as he rounded a corner. Dream smiled when he saw him, and strode forward. "There you are," Dream said. "I thought we lost you." "I'm just here," George said, waiting. Dream came to stand beside him, so now there were two gods in the mirror. "What's so interesting, George?" Dream asked, the quirk in the corner of his mouth betraying no real curiosity, just amusement. "I look tired," he replied, without thinking. "I shouldn't look tired. There's nothing to be tired of." And that was the truth. The past few months, since they'd finished the community house, had been good. Quiet. George had spent his days exploring every inch of the forest, regaining his footing in a world that he'd neglected for so long. It was his homecoming, and the forest welcomed him back easily. He let himself wander, aimlessly, often barefoot, just to feel the forest floor against his skin. He followed birds to their nests, grew bushes of fresh berries for the foxes that had taken to following him around, and thought once he might have spotted a stag, roaming between the trees, but it was gone before George could chase after it. And George would go back, at the end of the day, to a house. Not a roadside inn with beds that still smelled of the stranger that had occupied it before him. Not the cold hard ground. Not a tent of some army Sapnap had decided to join on a whim. A house. A home. He'd find Sapnap and Dream outside, sometimes, sparring, and he'd sit on the grass and watch them until dark. It was a routine, and George had fallen into it seamlessly. It was good. These were kinder times than George had ever found himself in. So why did he still look so tired? "I look like I've been fighting for my life," George said. "I don't know what you're talking about," Dream said, breezily, dismissively. "You look like George to me." "You don't understand." George could hear how he sounded. Petulant, defensive. He hated it. "What am I fighting against, Dream? What's making me look like this?" Dream met his eyes in the mirror. Unlike George, Dream hadn't changed since the first time they met. He was always going to be that boy in the snow, strange and familiar, offering the world for just a little bit of companionship. Even now, when he'd gotten what he'd so desperately wanted, every time George looked at him, he could still feel the bite of the northern cold. "You're thinking too much into it," said Dream, and that was that. He turned and began walking away, throwing George one last glance over his shoulder. Come on, we've still got a lot to do. George went to go follow, but something gave him pause. He watched Dream disappear around the corner, and then he turned around and grabbed the mirror from the wall. They found Sapnap standing in front of a glass case at the front of the shop, with the sullen-looking shopkeeper standing watch behind the counter. Hey, Dream, Sapnap said without turning. Look at this. When they stood on either side of him, he cut George a glance. George, he added, almost like an afterthought. What do you think of this? He waved a hand towards the glass case. Inside it was a sword, sharp and menacing. Dream whistled. Now that's a blade. What do you think it's made of? Obsidian. Sapnap breathed, near reverent. He reached out and laid a hand against the glass. Pure obsidian. They don't make these anymore. He turned to the shopkeeper, giddier than George had seen him in a while. How much will you take for it? The shopkeeper was a tall man, towering over even Dream. He looked more suited to the fields of war rather than behind the counter of a humble weapons shop in a village so quiet, George wondered if there was ever a need for his wares. He scowled at Sapnap's question, and George could see in him all the hard-bitten generals Sapnap had ever upstaged. Not for sale. The shopkeeper huffed. Pick something else. Sapnap raised an eyebrow. If it's not for sale, why is it here? Bragging rights, probably, Dream said coolly. Damn right I'm bragging, the shopkeeper said. That one there's a relic of one of the northern empires. Rare as shit. Cost me someone else's arm and leg if you take my meaning. Sapnap and Dream glanced at each other, both equally unimpressed. Everything has a price, Dream said, stepping towards the counter. Name yours. I'll triple it. The shopkeeper looked at Dream from head to toe, tilting his head as he did, just as baffled by Dream's audacity as George first was. Who was this green-eyed boy with the cocky smile who thought he could buy his way into anything? What heaven-high arrogance did he possess to believe it would work? Well, George thought, bittersweet. It worked on me. There is no price, the shopkeeper spat. It's decorative, just like that mirror your friend has tucked under his arm. Sapnap and Dream both spun around to look at George, who shrunk under their bewilderment. What? George said, tugging the mirror closer against him. It's for the house. It barely has anything in it. We bought that table from the market a month back, Sapnap said. That's something. Sapnap, that's one thing on our entire first floor. We don't even have chairs. Sapnap blinked at George in confusion. Why would we need chairs? And George remembered. Despite what they called it, the house was never meant to be a permanent thing. A shed, he'd told Sapnap. Somewhere to return to. Not somewhere to stay in. How had George forgotten? But George was more stubborn than they'd give him credit for. He set his jaw and said, I don't care. I want something to hang on the wall. He stomped towards the counter and fished a stack of coins from his pocket. You won't miss a mirror, but you would miss gold, wouldn't you? The shopkeeper snatched the coins from George's hand with a grunt. No need for that look in your eyes, kid. It's just a mirror. At that, George turned and walked straight out of the shop. Outside, he leaned against the wall and breathed out slowly, feeling something resettle within him. The village was quieter than they'd found it. This was the furthest they'd ever traveled away from the house. Every time they left the forest, they went further and further, stayed away for longer. It was, like everything else, good. Fine. Nice. They followed unfamiliar roads, rested under scattered stars. They got in random fights in random taverns and laughed about their bruises the next morning. Nothing had changed from the time before the house, except now they had a third person with them. And wasn't that what George had wanted? The shop's door opened, and Sapnap stepped out. "Where's Dream?" George asked. "Inside," Sapnap said, bumping George's shoulder so George would make room for him. George shuffled back, allowing Sapnap to lean beside him. "Still trying to haggle. And why aren't you?" Sapnap shrugged. "Didn't think it was worth it." "Oh, come on." "What?" "I know you. You want that sword more than anything." "Well, yeah, maybe. But something was clearly bothering you, so I came out here." Sapnap cut him a glance. "Don't look so surprised. You may not know this, George, but I do know when I'm being an ass. Though maybe not how." He knocked his knee against George's. "So, tell me, what did I do to break your heart this time?" George scoffed. "Don't flatter yourself." "What?" Sapnap said, grinning. "Am I not enough to break your heart, George?" "No one's ever broken my heart," he said, when what he meant was, no one's gotten close enough to try. Sapnap nodded, like he understood. "Personally," Sapnap said, "I never saw the appeal of heartbreak. You know what those mortal bards say about it? It's worth it." He rolled his eyes. "What a load of bullshit." He kicked at a stray pebble by his feet. They both watched as it knocked against the wood of a building across the street. "But you didn't answer my first question, George." "It's nothing. Leave it alone." "Horseshit. Tell me the truth." But what could George say? He couldn't say he'd foolishly fallen in love with the idea of staying put. He couldn't say he liked it, the slow days with nothing to do. He couldn't say that the past few months had been the best of his life, and he didn't want it to change, but was, slowly, inevitably. He couldn't say it hurt that Sapnap didn't seem to feel the same way. He couldn't say that sometimes he'd sit back and watch Dream make Sapnap laugh, effortlessly, while George had to fight for the same honor, and George would feel something close to jealousy because he'd known Sapnap first. That shouldn't matter, but it did, and there wasn't anything George could do to stop that sick feeling in his gut that he was losing something that used to be his alone. He couldn't say any of that. So instead he said, "If we start making our way back now, we'll be home before winter sets in." "George." He broke off at the sound of the door opening again, and they both turned to see Dream walk out of the shop. He grinned at Sapnap and then tossed him a heavy-looking scabbard. Sapnap's arms closed instinctively around it, and he didn't have to pull it out for George to know what it was. The obsidian sword. A gift from Dream. "No," Sapnap said, wide-eyed and ecstatic. "No fucking way." "Yes fucking way," Dream said, absolutely pleased with himself. "How'd you get him to budge?" Dream's grin stretched wider as he shrugged. "What can I say?" he said. "I'm a master of persuasion." Sapnap gave Dream a playful punch to the shoulder, and they fell against each other like long-lost brothers, laughing and cooing over Sapnap's shiny new toy. As they began heading towards the village gates, neither of them looked back to see if George would follow. They both knew he would, to the end of the world. He fell into step beside Sapnap, who'd unsheathed his sword and was lunging it with every few steps, skewering some invisible enemy. They found a field south of the village, where Sapnap managed to convince them to stop to watch him practice. That was how George found himself sitting beside Dream, their heavy bags and George's mirror stacked between them, both of them watching as Sapnap's sword arched elegantly through the air, over and over, a study in brutality. George drew his legs up towards him and rested his chin against his knees, trying to ignore Dream's attention sliding from Sapnap to him. He could feel it, like a physical thing, the weight of Dream's eyes. It burrowed under his skin, invasive, tearing through him from the inside out. But when he finally gave in and turned his head to meet Dream's gaze, he found Dream smiling at him. Always smiling. "What?" George asked. "What?" Dream echoed. "Why are you looking at me? Am I not allowed to do that?" "Well, you're allowed," It's allowed, but I don't know. What don't you know, George? A lot of things, George said. Like what you're the god of. That was almost enough to knock Dream's smile off his face. You don't trust me? It wasn't a question. It was an accusation. George felt shame, unbidden, rise to his face, and he had to look away before Dream could call him out on it. I thought we were already friends, George, Dream said, his voice quiet. I thought I'd already proven myself to you. We are friends, George said. But it's just sometimes I forget why. Out of the corner of his eye, he watched Dream recoil. He almost felt bad for it. Sometimes I look at you and I see a stranger. He placed his hand against the dirt beside him, watched as small white flowers grew between his fingertips, climbing over his knuckles like shackles keeping him rooted to the earth. I know Sapnap. Sapnap knows me. But who are you, Dream? I'm your friend, George, Dream said, his voice sounding strained. Isn't that enough? I fought for you to stay, George said evenly. He wrenched his hand from the hold of the flowers, let them scatter upwards into the wind like backward snow. Then he turned to Dream and said, Some part of me is still waiting for the day I'll regret that decision. Dream looked at George, with a curious glimmer in his eyes. It reminded George a bit of how mortal parents looked at a misbehaving child, not with anger, but as if they were asking themselves, where did I go wrong? Why won't you obey? And then the first arrow came. It struck the ground between them, making George scramble away. But Dream was already on his feet, a blur of motion as he gathered their things, thrusting George's bag into his arms before calling out Sapnap's name. Sapnap whirled towards them, his face a mirror of George's confusion. What's going... He was cut off as the second arrow flew past, missing Sapnap's face by mere inches. This time, they could follow the arrow's trajectory, down the path they'd taken and right to a man on horseback, already knocking the third arrow. And this time, he was aiming for George. Fuck, Sapnap said, sheathing his sword and grabbing George by the arm, hauling him upwards. Fuck, George, duck! George felt Sapnap's hand against the back of his head, pushing him down halfway. He heard the arrow whiz by, felt Dream's hand around his wrist, pulling him forwards, and then they were running. They were a whirlwind of limbs, and George couldn't tell who was ahead of him and who was by his side, only that they were all heading towards a cluster of trees at the very edge of the field. Another arrow flew past, this time nicking George's cheek. He hissed at the pain, but he didn't stop running. Go! Dream, or Sapnap, or maybe it was George himself, yelled. Just go! So close. They were so close to the trees they'd lose him there. There was another whistle, another arrow flying, and George waited for the silence of an arrow that failed to find its mark. But instead there was a shout. He watched Sapnap go down, clutching at his leg. It was not the worst injury the god of war had ever suffered. George had inflicted worse himself, in those earlier days when they argued more than they spoke, and mistrust filled their veins like venom. It wouldn't be enough to kill him. It wouldn't be enough to leave a scar. But it was enough to make him stumble. It was enough for the rider to catch up to him. George spun, his movements slow, in time to watch the rider rein his horse to a stop and jump down. Sapnap was on his knees, still struggling to stand, and he couldn't see the rider behind him, unsheathing a sword and raising it. George tried to move, to lift his feet, his hands, scream, anything. But he found himself frozen, his body disobeying every order. He was not in control. Sapnap was going to die. George was going to watch Sapnap die. He waited for it. The sound of the sword meeting immortal skin. The sound of his entire world shattering. The sound of loss. But it was Dream's voice he heard. Sapnap! Dream yelled. Behind you! That should have been George's job. That should have been his duty. But instead it was Dream spurring Sapnap to action, warning him to turn around, giving him enough time to kick out with his uninjured leg, catching the rider's knee. It was Dream running forward as the rider buckled. It was Dream unsheathing Sapnap's sword and swinging. It was Dream who stood over the rider as he fell backwards. It was Dream who dealt one last blow. It was Dream, sword bloody and eyes wild, who turned to crouch beside Sapnap, his hand on his shoulder, asking, "Are you all right?" "Damn right I'm all right," Sapnap said, falling onto the earth. "Just as soon as someone gets this fucking arrow out of my leg." Dream grinned down at him, then at George, who stood, useless, a couple of paces away. "Come on, George," he said. The threads inside George snapped, and he found himself able to walk again. He moved towards Sapnap, who stared up at him from the ground, blinking slowly. "Hey, George," he said. He moved his arm from his chest, and that was when George realized what Sapnap had been crouching over, what he'd been carrying, what he'd protected. "Please tell me it's not broken, or I'd have taken an arrow to the knee for nothing." In his arms was George's mirror. "You," George breathed. "Oh, such an idiot." It was the closest he'd ever get to love. They picked him up, slung each of his arms over their shoulders. George and Dream, with Sapnap bleeding between them. Brothers, maybe, in another life. They helped Sapnap over to the fallen rider, whose familiar face stared lifelessly into the sky. "The shopkeeper from the village," Sapnap said, his brows drawing together in confusion. "Why the hell would he want us dead?" There was a cut on his temple that didn't look to be made by a sword, the blood around it already dry. It was an old wound, as old as the last time they'd seen him. Sapnap and George turned to Dream, who looked aghast by the accusation. "Okay," he relented. "So maybe my skills of persuasion involved knocking him out cold and stealing from his shop, but hey," he added, that easy smile returning, "at least I got you this wicked sword." Sapnap shook his head, caught between exasperation and begrudging respect. "You're insane." "You once joined a war on a drunken dare," George pointed out. Sapnap narrowed his eyes at him. "Meaning?" "Meaning," George said, meeting Dream's gaze over Sapnap's head. "Birds of the same feather and all that." "Birds of the same feather," Dream repeated, smiling at George. "Flock and fly together." And fall together, too, George thought. But instead he said, "And look, the man left us his horse when he died. Isn't that just so nice of him?" They named the horse Spirit, after Dream pulled the arrow out of Sapnap's leg, which involved aggressive cursing and threats of violence, and George grew some herbs for a poultice. "It's either this or infection," George warned after Sapnap told him to fuck off. They wrapped bandages around the worst of the damage, and then helped Sapnap onto Spirit's saddle. More cursing and threatening followed, with Sapnap proclaiming he didn't need to be treated like some helpless waif who rode around not doing anything. "Who says you're not doing anything?" Dream asked, before tossing most of his things at Sapnap. Sapnap caught them with a grunt, careful to keep George's mirror safe, before leveling Dream with a glare. "You're lucky I owe you my life." "We can talk about owing when we get back to the house," Dream said, taking Spirit's reins and leading them home. It was not a quiet journey. With them, nothing ever was. Sapnap complained, George shot back, and Dream rolled his eyes until they pulled him into the argument. They argued over everything and anything. Whether or not they were lost, they were for a little while, thanks to Sapnap's insistence that they'd passed by the same boulder twice. Whether or not it was morally correct to steal a dead man's horse. Obviously immoral, Dream said. With gods, there's nothing else to be. And whether they'd locked the community house's door before they left. George was the last one out, Dream pointed out as they walked an increasingly familiar landscape. George could almost see a suggestion of a forest in the horizon, so close his fingers ached to reach out and pluck it out of the sky. If the door's unlocked, it's on him. What's the worst that can happen? George said with a roll of his eyes. Even if somebody miraculously finds some random house in some random forest, what's there for them to steal? My weapons are in a chest in the kitchen, Sapnap said defensively. Right, George said dryly. How could I possibly forget? You're being very inconsiderate of my feelings right now, George. What does it matter to you anyway? George spat. It's a house, a shed. You have nothing to lose there. Sapnap pulled Spirit's reins, halting all of them in their tracks. George was ready with a half-hearted jab at Sapnap's theatrics, but the words died on his tongue when he saw the look in Sapnap's eyes. What do you mean by that? Sapnap said, coldly. George felt like he was treading dangerous territory, but he'd never been one to be careful. The house doesn't mean anything to you. Just a house with a table that doesn't need chairs. That's what you said before. It doesn't need to feel like a home, he almost said, betraying the heart that Sapnap once called too soft. Like anything. It's nothing. A house that we built, Sapnap reminded him, his words measured. Don't presume to know all the things I have to lose. You don't know shit, George. Easy now, Dream said, hands raised placatingly, stepping between them. Always the hero. It's just a lock on the door, all right? It's never just anything with George, Sapnap said, and spurred Spirit on, leaving George in his wake, wondering if he was meant to feel known or hurt. Sapnap rode ahead with his anger, and all George had for company was the spring-eyed god of who knew what. He wanted to feel that envy again, that fury that Dream seemed to so quickly earn both George's curiosity and Sapnap's trust. He had to remind himself of that every now and again. He had let Dream in. Now it was a question of what Dream had to steal. He reached for his distrust. His hands closed around air. I suppose, George said quietly, looking anywhere but at Dream, or at Sapnap's distant form. I should thank you. Dream hummed. For what? For saving Sapnap, George said. Thank you. There was a beat of silence, and then Dream chuckled. So, he said, and George could hear the smile in his voice. That's what it takes to get you to love me. Love? George scoffed. Sure. Call it what you want to, whatever makes you happy. Now I wonder what it'll take to make you hate me. At that, George finally looked at him. I wonder too, he said. The forest came alive at George's return, but he barely noticed. All he knew was to follow the road home. In the clearing, he found Spirit grazing alone. The community house's door was open. Sapnap? George called out as he stepped into the threshold, afraid of the silence that came in response. Sapnap, where are you? The bags Sapnap had been carrying were littered across the floor, but that wasn't what made George's chest tighten. Hanging in the hallway, right across the door, so it was the first thing anyone would see when they came in, was George's mirror. He looked at his own reflection, saw Dream hovering behind him, and called out again. Sapnap? Here. Sapnap called out faintly. George rushed into the kitchen and found him sitting on the table, pursing his lips in that way he often did when he was forced to admit he was wrong. He cleared his throat, and the small movement made the table creak under him. He met George's eyes. We need chairs, he said, and that was it. There was nothing more to be said. They built a home, just like George wanted. They still left on their adventures, but every time they came back, they returned carrying things that would be worth stealing. Vases for flowers, display stands for Sapnap's collection of axes and bows and swords, books that looked old enough to crumble under their fingers, and none of them would ever care enough to read, maps of the world that gradually filled with tally marks of all the places they'd been. The shopkeeper would not be the last of the people they'd kill for each other. Over the years, George would lose count. It was a strange ritual they all had a bloody hand in. With every life taken, it was a promise. "I'll kill for you," they said with every swing of their blade. "That's how much I love you." They still joined Sapnap's silly wars, still picked fights with everyone who looked at them wrong. They were gods, after all, and they had to spend their immortality somewhere. They simply chose to spend it together, angry at the world and willing to take it out on everyone else. Sapnap and Dream were merciless on the battlefield, twin soldiers carving their way through the enemy army. "I'd help you win a war," Dream had promised them, all those years ago, and he'd fulfilled that vow a dozen times over. Each kingdom toppled, and each empire burned to the ground, just another offering to the war god's altar. And George could tell Sapnap reveled in it. And if it was enough for Sapnap, it was enough for George. They'd stand in the wake of their war, hearing the thunderous cheering of the victors, the groaning of the half-dead. War was everything to the mortals. To George and Sapnap and Dream, it was just another week. They kept their heads down, stacked their spoils of war on spirit, and made their way to wherever they wanted. Once, on their way to someplace else, George asked Dream, "If you could only save me or Sapnap, who would you save?" "You," Dream said. "Wow." Sapnap, leading Spirit ahead by his reins, turned to raise an eyebrow at Dream. "You could have at least hesitated. Sapnap, you can survive without me," Dream said, exasperatedly. "You don't need my help." "And you think George does?" Sapnap's grin turned cocky. "You really don't know George, huh?" "I'm a bit hurt, Dream," George said, clutching his chest dramatically. "You should know me better by now. How long have we known each other? Decades?" With an odd smile, Dream said, "Maybe a bit more than that." "No, definitely just decades," Sapnap said, patting Spirit's muzzle affectionately. "Your friendship's about as old as trusty Spirit here." "Please don't tell me you're using a horse to measure how long you've known me." "When Spirit dies," George said, "our friendship dies too. That's the rule." "So it is written," Sapnap said, nodding solemnly, "in the great rule book of life." "What rule book?" Dream exclaimed exasperatedly. George met Sapnap's eyes, shining with glee, and their laughter escaped from them like a prisoner freed, tasting freedom at last. It was easy to forget they were living on borrowed time. He could pinpoint the exact moment things went wrong. He'd found Sapnap lying outside the house, staring up at the clouds above. He barely acknowledged George's shadow slanting over him, only patted the ground beside him and said, "Come here." George laid himself on the grass, resting his head against Sapnap's stomach. He could feel each and every one of Sapnap's breaths, in and out, steady as his own heartbeat. The trees seemed to close over them, blanketing them from the sun, and for a while they indulged themselves in the silence. It had been a while since it was just the two of them, which reminded George. "Where's Dream?" he asked. Sapnap made a vague motion with his hands. "Somewhere. Probably promising a pack of wolves his unwavering loyalty if they'd only be his friend." George snorted. "He isn't that desperate anymore, now that he has us." Sapnap scoffed. "Come on, you don't really think we're enough for him, do you?" "You don't? I thought you liked him." Sapnap was quiet for a long while. Then he said, "Of course I do. He's like... well, meeting him was like meeting you, I guess. I don't believe in fate or destiny or all that garbage mortals talk about, but it feels that way sometimes. Like we're right for each other. Kind of like how you just know when a weapon is the right weight for you." "Always weapons with you," George said, but he didn't disagree. Another vague gesture with Sapnap's hands. "He fits with us. Perfectly. You were perfect. Dream is perfect. But I'm not going to fool myself into thinking he doesn't want more." "More?" George asked. "More of what?" "I don't know. Just more, I guess. It's like he's still looking for something, and he'll leave us behind the moment he finds it. Like that time he left me in the dust because he thought there'd be wine hidden in some castle. When Sapnap spoke again, George could hear the thoughtful frown in his voice. That wasn't with Dream. That was you and me. No, George said. I could have sworn. Dream! Sapnap sat upright, accidentally knocking George off him. George straightened, glaring at Sapnap before turning to where he'd seen Dream. He was ready to demand where Dream had been, but the sight of him stopped George in his tracks. Something was wrong. Something was very, very wrong. Dream? Sapnap said again, more cautiously this time. Dream, what's going on? Dream had stopped at the very edge of the clearing, his face hidden by the shifting shadows. He leaned against the tree, his chest heaving, his head bowed low. Over the years, George had seen Dream take an arrow to the shoulder, get tossed back by a war hammer, face down whole armies, and sometimes Sapnap when they were both in a mood. But he'd never seen Dream this broken. When Dream finally raised his head, George could swear his eyes looked haunted. Or hunted. He knows, Dream said. And he's coming for me. And then he fell to his knees. Sapnap and George were on their feet in the blink of an eye, surging towards him, joining him in the shadows. What's wrong? George asked, placing a hand on Dream's trembling shoulder. Who's coming for you? And that was when George realized Dream wasn't trembling. He was laughing. It was a triumphant laugh, the laugh of a man who knew his pieces were finally falling into place. George and Sapnap met each other's eyes, concerned and baffled. Dream straightened, still laughing, and caught both of Sapnap and George's hands. He squeezed, tight enough to hurt, and leaned towards George until he was all George could see. His eyes were so green. The beginning, Dream whispered, his breathing ghosting over George's skin. My beginning. The reason for everything. He wants to be my end too, George, but you won't let him, will you? Fucking hell, Sapnap said angrily. Let go of him, you're hurting George. But Dream only squeezed tighter. George? Dream said. Sapnap? The angel of death. The angel of death is coming for me now. But we'll come for him first. You and me. He smiled, and it was a twisted smile, unrecognizable from the god George had come to know. But that wasn't right, George realized. He didn't know Dream, after all. Dream was unknowable. It's us. Always us. Until your bitter fucking ends.